My name is Carmen. I'm sitting in my dorm room at Penn State, surrounded by textbooks and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. The maples outside my window are ablaze with orange and red, and the air carries the scent of wood smoke and possibility. It's hard to believe that just a year ago, my future was on the verge of being crushed. I remember that fateful Sunday dinner like it was yesterday. I'd set the table as I always did, with my father's plate at the head, his water glass on the right, and his napkin folded into a rectangle. The smell of roast chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air, but instead of feeling at home, I felt like I was in a trap. My grandmother, Mrs. Thompson, arrived at 5:45, wearing her favorite camel cashmere coat. She kissed my forehead and squeezed my hand, then set her leather handbag on the floor beside her chair. I didn't notice then, but it was heavier than usual. My father, Mr. Thompson, came downstairs whistling, a rare sight. He clapped my 14-year-old brother, Jake, on the shoulder and said, "Smells good." I knew why he was in a good mood. He thought he had everything under control. After everyone had their plates and my father had taken his first bite, I took a deep breath and pulled out the envelope from under my seat cushion. "Dad," I said, my voice steady but my hands shaking. "I got accepted to UCLA with a scholarship." I held the envelope out to him like an offering, praying that he would be proud. Instead, he set down his fork and looked at the envelope with a distant, vaguely offended curiosity. He took it, pulled out the letter, and read it slowly. His jaw tightened with each line, and then his face went red. He tore the letter in half, the sound cutting through the kitchen like a knife. "No daughter of mine needs an education," he said, his voice cold and level. "You're staying right here." I looked down at the pieces of my letter, feeling the weight of 9 months of hard work and sacrifice. All of it, gone in an instant. Then my father turned to my grandmother. "This is your doing, isn't it?" he said, pointing his fork at her. Filling her head with ideas. My grandmother sat perfectly still, her hands resting on either side of her plate. She didn't say a word. "Clear the table, Carmen," my father said without looking at me. "This conversation is over." I stood up, my body moving on autopilot. 9 years of being his housekeeper had ingrained the routine in me. But as I reached for his plate, I heard my grandmother's voice. "Sit down, Carmen," she said, her voice quiet but firm. My father's eyes snapped to my grandmother. "Ma, stay out of this. This is my house, my daughter, my decision." My uncle, Mr. Johnson, shifted in his seat. "Maybe we should talk about this," he said. "You don't get a vote either," my father cut in, his eyes never leaving my grandmother. Then he turned back to me. "I called UCLA on Thursday. I tried to withdraw your application myself. They said they needed your signature, but you're going to sign that withdrawal form tonight, right here at this table, in front of everyone." My grandmother sat still for exactly 30 seconds, her eyes fixed on my father. Then she set her napkin down, folded it neatly, and placed it to the right of her plate. She pushed her chair back and stood up, moving slowly and deliberately. She walked to the coat closet by the front door and took out her camel cashmere coat. She put it on one arm at a time and buttoned it at the waist with steady hands. My father looked up from his plate. "Where are you going?" "Dinner's not over." My grandmother walked back to the table and stood behind her chair. She looked directly at my father and said 2 words, "Pack her bags." My father laughed, a big, hearty laugh. "Pack her bags? And send her where? With what money?" My grandmother didn't answer. She reached down, unclasped her leather handbag, and pulled out a stack of papers held together with a single staple. She placed them on the table in front of my father. It was a deed, a property deed, notarized and filed with the county recorder's office. At the top, in black ink that 22 years hadn't faded, was one name, Mrs. Thompson, sole owner. "This house has been in my name since 2002, my grandmother said, her voice steady. I bought it with your father's life insurance money and my savings after he passed. I let you live here rent-free because you were grieving and you had 2 children who needed a roof. But I never, not once, signed this house over to you, Robert. There is no transfer, no agreement. The deed is mine, and it has always been mine. My father's smile collapsed. He looked at the deed, then at my grandmother, and then forced out a laugh. So what? You're going to kick me out? Your own son? I'm giving you a choice, my grandmother said. Carmen goes to UCLA this fall with my financial support. You let her go, you support her, and you keep living here. Or you fight this, and I call my attorney tonight. My uncle leaned forward and picked up the deed, reading it carefully. His eyebrows climbed his forehead, and he set it down without a word. The look he gave my father was one of shock and recognition. Jake's mouth was open. He looked at me, then at my grandmother, and then back at me, like he was watching the world rearrange itself. And me? I sat there, staring at the deed, and one thought repeated itself over and over, 20 years. My father had been living a lie, controlling every aspect of our lives, all built on a foundation of falsehood. My father's face cycled through a range of emotions, confusion, fury, and then a hard, brittle composure. He pushed the deed to the side of the table. You think a piece of paper scares me? I've been maintaining this house for 20 years. I've paid the bills, fixed the roof, and replaced the furnace. You think any court would just hand it to you? My grandmother didn't respond. She stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, and let him talk. And even if the house is yours, Ma, my father said, spreading his hands wide. I'll fight it. I'll get a lawyer. You really want to drag your own family to court? That was his card, the same guilt trip he'd used on me for years. But this time, it didn't work. My grandmother reached into her handbag and pulled out a flip phone. She pressed one button, and the kitchen was filled with the tinny ringing of the phone. Hello, David, she said, her voice calm and conversational. It's Mrs. Thompson. I need you to begin the process we discussed. Yes, the 30-day notice. Yes, tonight. Thank you, David. I appreciate it. She closed the phone and slipped it back into her handbag. My father stared at her, his laugh gone, his bluster faded. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice cracked on the second word. Robert, my grandmother said, and for the first time, I heard a hint of sadness in her voice. I have never bluffed a day in my life. You have 30 days or you let Carmen go to college. Choose. My grandmother turned to me. Pack a bag, honey. You're coming home with me tonight. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of jelly. I looked at my father, and for the first time in 9 years, I didn't drop my eyes. I've been sitting down for 9 years, Dad. I'm done, I said. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I think it was the first time anyone in that house had said no to him and meant it. I walked upstairs to my room, the smallest bedroom in the house. My backpack, a faded JanSport I'd had since freshman year, was already half-packed. Mrs. Harris, my school counselor, had told me months ago to keep a go bag ready, just in case. I grabbed it and stuffed in a few more clothes, my toothbrush, the SAT prep book, and my journal. Then I reached into my biology textbook and pulled out the photo of my mother, a small snapshot of her holding me at the county fair, both of us laughing. I slipped it into my jacket pocket against my heart. Jake was standing in the hallway, his eyes red. Carmen, he said. I pulled him into a hug. I'm not leaving you, I said. I'm just leaving this. I went downstairs, and my father was standing at the bottom of the staircase, blocking the door. If you walk out that door, he said, his voice shaking, don't come back. I walked past him, and he didn't move to stop me. I think some part of him knew that the only thing keeping me there was the lock, and the lock had just been changed. My grandmother had the car running, the headlights on, and the passenger door open. I got in, put my backpack on my lap, and didn't look back at the house. As we drove away, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never known before. But I also knew that the fight wasn't over. The next few days were a blur. My father called my grandmother's phone non-stop, but she let every call go to voicemail. He called me too, at first with a soft, almost unrecognizable voice, asking me to come home. But as the days went by, his tone turned cold and threatening. He also took to Facebook, rewriting the story to make himself the victim. My daughter ran away because her grandmother is manipulating her, he wrote. Please pray for our family. The story spread like wildfire in our small town, and soon everyone was talking about it. I was called a selfish brat, and my grandmother was labeled a controlling old woman. At school, it was even worse. Kids I barely knew stopped me in the hallway, asking me if it was true that my grandmother had kicked my father out. One girl from my English class said loud enough for everyone to hear, "My mom says your dad is heartbroken." I smiled, nodded, and kept walking. But each comment was a small cut, and by Thursday afternoon, I was bleeding. Then, on Monday morning, something arrived at my father's door. The process server, a man named Mr. Brown, knocked at 8:15. My father opened the door in his work boots and undershirt, a mug of coffee in his hand. Mr. Brown handed him the envelope, and my father signed. Inside was a 30-day notice to quit, issued by my grandmother's attorney. My father called my grandmother immediately. I was sitting at her kitchen table, eating cereal, when her phone rang and she put it on speaker. "You can't do this to your own son," my father shouted. "I gave you a choice, Robert," my grandmother said, her voice calm. "You made yours." She hung up, and my father went looking for a lawyer. In our small town, the options were limited. The first attorney he called, a woman named Miss Green, declined, saying it was a conflict of interest. The second lawyer, a man from a nearby town, agreed to review the case. After looking at the deed, the tax records, and the complete absence of any lease or written agreement, he told my father the truth. "If the deed's in her name and there's no lease, you're a month-to-month tenant at best. She has every right to do this." That same evening, Jake called me from his friend's phone. His voice was small and careful. "Dad hasn't cooked once since you left," he whispered. "He doesn't know where the plates are." That night, my grandmother and I sat on her sofa with mugs of chamomile tea, and she told me the whole truth. "My husband, your grandfather, was a good provider, but he was also controlling. He decided what I wore, where I went, and who I could talk to. I wanted to teach, but he said a wife's place was in the home. I lost 15 years waiting for him to change his mind." She took a sip of tea. "When I saw Robert doing the same thing to your mother, I thought I was watching a rerun of my own life. I told your mother to leave, but she said she couldn't. She was afraid he'd take the kids." My grandmother's voice grew thin. "Then she got sick, and it didn't matter anymore. After your grandfather died, his life insurance paid out. I combined it with my teaching savings and bought this house outright in 2002. I let Robert live here rent-free because he needed stability, but I never transferred the deed. I knew who he was becoming, and I kept that deed because I believed that one day I might need it." She reached under the sofa cushion and pulled out a manila folder. "Here are the property tax records, every year for 22 years. My name is on every receipt. And here's a printout of an email from David confirming that the title is clear." Then she said something that made the room go very still. "There's one more thing. Your mother left you a letter." I asked about the letter, but my grandmother shook her head. "Not yet, sweetheart. When you're ready." Over the next few weeks, we prepared for the court hearing. David walked us through everything. The deed was unambiguous, and my grandmother was the sole legal owner. My father had no lease, no rental agreement, and no written promise of any kind. Under California law, he was a tenant at will, and my grandmother had the right to revoke his permission to occupy the property with proper notice. Mrs. Harris, meanwhile, had been working on my college application. She contacted UCLA's admissions office to confirm that my acceptance was still active. My father hadn't managed to withdraw it because they required my signature, which he didn't have. The financial aid office walked us through the numbers. My grandmother's savings, combined with the scholarship, covered the first year of tuition with room to apply for additional aid. Mrs. Harris helped me file a FAFSA with a dependency override, supported by a letter she wrote documenting my home situation. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. The courtroom was a small room in the municipal building, filled with fluorescent lights and wood-paneled walls. My father sat on the left side with his lawyer, a man named Mr. Black. He was wearing a dress shirt and khaki pants, but his work boots peeked out beneath the cuffs. My grandmother sat on the right side with David. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, her silver hair in a low bun, her posture straight and proud. I sat in the first row behind my grandmother, my hands in my lap, my backpack at my feet. Behind us were Uncle Johnson, who had driven 40 minutes to be there, and a few faces I recognized from town. The court clerk, a young woman with a laptop, recorded everything. The room was small, but it had an audience, and I could feel the tension in the air. Judge Miller entered, a woman in her early 60s, wearing silver reading glasses. She sat down, opened the file, and said, "Let's begin." Mr. Black spoke quickly, building my father's case. He argued that my father had maintained the property for 2 decades, paid the utilities, and invested significant sweat equity into the home. He claimed there was an implied agreement that my grandmother would eventually transfer ownership. Judge Miller listened without interrupting. She took notes as Mr. Black spoke, her expression impassive. Then David stood up. He was quieter than Mr. Black, his voice calm and measured. He presented the deed, the property tax records, and the title search, all confirming that my grandmother was the sole legal owner. "Your Honor," David said, "the deed is unambiguous. My client is the sole legal owner. There is no lease, no written agreement, and no evidence, written or otherwise, of a promise to transfer. Mr. Thompson is, at best, a tenant at will." The 30-day notice was properly served. Judge Miller turned to my father. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "can you present any written document, a lease, a contract, a letter, anything at all, that shows your mother agreed to transfer ownership or grant you a permanent right to reside in this property?" My father looked at Mr. Black, who looked at the table. It was understood, my father said. "She's my mother. Mothers don't need a contract with their sons." Judge Miller put her glasses back on. "Mr. Thompson, this court deals in documents, not assumptions." She reviewed the file for another 60 seconds, then ruled. "Mrs. Thompson has the legal right to evict. Mr. Thompson is ordered to vacate within 15 days, reduced from 30 because he had already been given the original 30-day notice and had chosen to ignore it." My father shot to his feet, his chair scraping back against the tile floor. "This is insane," he shouted. "She's doing this because of a girl who wants to go to school?" The room went silent. Everyone in the courtroom heard his words, and the meaning behind them was clear. Judge Miller stared at my father over her glasses for a full 3 seconds before saying, "Sit down, Mr. Thompson." He sat, but the damage was done. Everyone in that room understood exactly what kind of man he was. After the hearing, we walked out of the courthouse into the bright fall morning. My father stood next to his truck, a rusted Ford F-150 with a cracked taillight and a faded bumper sticker that read, "Support local plumbers." He had his keys in his hand, but he wasn't moving. He looked at my grandmother and me as we came down the steps, David holding the door behind us. "You took everything from me," he said, his voice hollow. My grandmother stopped on the bottom step. She looked at her son, her only son, and I saw a look of sadness cross her face. I didn't take anything, Robert. I just stopped giving. Uncle Johnson walked up beside my father.